All right, good evening, everyone, and thank you all for joining us. My name is Alyssa Karpinka, and I'm the event coordinator for McNally Robinson Booksellers in Saskatoon. This event is coming to you from Treaty 6 territory, the traditional lands of the Cree, Saulteaux, Dene, Dakota, Lakota, Nakota, and Métis nations. Just to note that this event is being live streamed to our YouTube page, so please be aware of the webcam next to you. It is my pleasure to welcome you to the Saskatoon launch of Ukrainian Ritual on the Prairies, Growing a Ukrainian Canadian Identity by Natalie Kononenko and published by McGill-Queen's University Press. Thank you to Natalie for being here tonight and for working with us to create this event. Natalie Kononenko received her PhD from Harvard University. Her dissertation was based on her fieldwork in Turkey. She's also done work in Ukraine, Canada, and Kazakhstan. Her book, Ukrainian Minstrels and the Blind Shall Sing, won the Kovalev Prize and the Best Book Award of the American Association of Ukrainian Studies. Her book, Ukrainian Epic and Historical Song, Folklore in Context, received the Barbara Helt Award for Best Translation. She has also authored other books and numerous articles. She was an award-winning teacher and is a pioneer in digital humanities. Her latest book, Ukrainian Ritual on the Prairies, draws on more than 10 years of fieldwork and interviews to give voice to rural Ukrainian Canadians and their accounts of family traditions. Kononenko highlights the creative accomplishments of these people in developing a culture that is both Ukrainian and Canadian. I'll now turn things over to Natalie. Please give her a warm welcome.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you. As Alyssa said, one of my purposes here, I've been talking to various people as we get set up. And we're talking about churches closing and depopulation. I'll talk more about that when I talk about the book. But maybe when I set out to do this, as my husband knows, I wanted to give voice to ordinary people. People write about people in power. People write about politicians. But nobody writes about the regular guys. You know, as I said, politicians make your life miserable. People, ordinary people, make your life worth living. If we pay more attention to this material, maybe we wouldn't have the problems that we've all mentioned as we were chatting prior to my talk. Maybe we wouldn't have as much depopulation in the prairies. Maybe we wouldn't have as many church closings as I'm going to mention. So, join me in supporting the ordinary guy on the Canadian prairies. Now, this is my book, published by Queen's McGill. They've been a great publisher, very, very nice. I'm going to give you some background, both about me and about the work itself. Now, why did I do this? I was a child of Ukrainian refugees. I was born in a DP camp right after World War II. And the reason my parents left Ukraine was Grandpa, who was with me in this picture. Grandpa was a raving nationalist, which is very much apropos what is happening politically, and I should shut up about the politics. Anyway, about what's happening politically today, Grandpa kept getting arrested. He was an agricultural economist, and he said, you shouldn't do this. People are dying, people are starving. He kept getting arrested. So my family fled west. They literally walked across Europe heading west. I ended up in New Jersey. Yay, New Jersey. Sponsored by nationals who were already in the US. I'm growing up in New Jersey. There are Ukrainians in New Jersey. And as a kid, I'm the granddaughter of this famous Ukrainian nationalist. There's an incredible pressure to be a good Ukrainian. I said, okay, so what's being a good Ukrainian? I'm sorry. This is a picture of Avraменko. You know that Avraменko is the father of Ukrainian dance. And I call this the Avraменko syndrome. You kind of have to be a super Ukrainian, and not only a super Ukrainian, but you have to be totally pure. Avraменko wouldn't let the people in his dance group, not only he wouldn't let them drink and smoke, he wouldn't let them chew gum. Okay? And, so I'm being under all this pressure, membership in Ukrainian groups, and et cetera, et cetera. a lot of pressure on me to talk Ukrainian. I am now a native speaker of Ukrainian. As a kid, I did not, well, I knew a few words, but not a whole lot. Why? Grandpa, the famous Ukrainian nationalist, spoke Russian. You know, it was the language of the elite. He had to. He was a professor. You couldn't be a professor at that time and speak anything other than Russian. I'm in Bowdoin, New Jersey. You think there's a Ukrainian school? No way. Is there a Ukrainian school anywhere else? No way. And then, you know, the nationalists were really mean to me in ways that you'll have to ask me about after my talk. So, you know, I'm saying, I kind of have this saying it's ambiguous is an understatement attitude to what being a Ukrainian means. And then actually, it was at Harvard when I was adopted by various Ukrainians that I learned Ukrainian. I developed a much more positive attitude toward being a Ukrainian. The real thing that happened that made me very comfortable with being a Ukrainian and kind of an ardent supporter is the project that's written about in this group. The project was done by my colleagues, John Paul Himka, Francis Swadepa, this is John Paul's daughter. It was called the Sanctuary Project. For 10 years, we drove across the prairies. Oops. And it was, I have to find the cap to this, which just popped off. Anyway, we drove across the prairies. Oh, you got it. And it was Alberta and Saskatchewan. We were asked why we didn't do Manitoba. And let me say, these provinces are big. It's a lot of work. If you look at the book, you'll see how much we covered. It was an incredible amount. And we interviewed students. We took various volunteers like Keith Bell over there and assorted students. And we documented Ukrainian churches. I'll talk in a second about why we had to document Ukrainian churches. It was in this project and meeting the people on the prairies that I got a good idea of what it means to be Ukrainian and a definition of Ukrainian that to me was quite an acceptable and even a pleasant definition. What was the Sanctuary Project? Why were we documenting these churches? Well, Ukrainians started coming to the prairies at the end of the 19th century. They came until the First World War. Then there was a stop then between the First and the Second World Wars. These people were farmers, as I am sure you know from living in Saskatchewan. After World War II, the people that came were like my parents. They were political refugees. They settled in cities. Their attitude toward, well, they were different people. There are gorgeous churches on the prairies. And one of the things about the churches on the prairies, which I think is so important, is that they weren't just religious centers, although being religious is very important. And I happen to be on one of the consistory committees of the Orthodox Church. But it was a whole lot more. It was, you know, the churches helped maintain Ukrainian identity. Okay? It wasn't just a religious thing. You could learn language in the Ukrainian church. There was all sorts of Ukrainian activities, embroidery, pisanka art, etc., etc. The churches counteracted assimilation efforts. Elsie Kabulich is here. She won the Order of Canada. That picture has her holding the Order of Canada. She went to church. Not only was she told she shouldn't speak Ukrainian, she should speak English, but her original name was Lisa. She was told, Lisa's not a real name. You got to be Elsie. So she became Elsie. Anyway, so the church counteracted those assimilation efforts and maintained Ukrainian identity. The churches are stunning, as I'm sure Keith will agree. The churches, the churches are to die for. I've considered doing a picture book, and you can talk to me at the end of this whether a picture book is something that's interesting and attractive to you. One of the problems with doing a picture book, by the way, is money. You know, it costs a lot of money to print color pictures. I'm very grateful to McGill-Queen for what they've done, and I think they've done a beautiful job, but an all picture book would be a ton of money. The other thing that the church does, and it's very important specifically for Canada, it helps create a flexible idea of what it means to be a Ukrainian. Some of you may know this guy's father, Taras Udod, who served in Hafford for a long time. But all the Prairie priests, okay, you're a priest, you got 12 churches. Can you do a liturgy every Sunday? No way. So there's a flexible idea of what you need to do. The churches introduce and in a sense sanction the idea of flexibility. You know what Saskatchewan roads are like? I do. You probably know too, right? My husband the mechanic would say to my husband after he took my car and after I've been driving around the Saskatchewan, where the F has she been? Because I'd stripped the engine shield. This isn't your honeymoon. You're driving down the road and you go, oops. Surprise! I had to back up because there was water. You see the water on both sides. I had students in my car, so I was absolutely terrified. You know, if I'd been by myself, I would have been less terrified than me with some graduate students in the car having to back up down this dirt road with water on either side. Okay, some of the other flexibility. Look. When should you have Provodi? You should have Provodi, which is great blessing. It's bringing the blessings of Easter, the blessings of Christianity to the graves. You should have it after Easter. Well, guess what? If you only have one priest for 12 churches, what can you do? Not a whole lot. So one of the things that churches do is combine Provodi with either Prasnik or Chram. This is again in Hafford. The grave blessings, and I'll talk more about graves later, are incredibly important because graves link you not to your ancestors and also to Canadian land. So these people drove from Alberta because they wanted to go to their grave blessing, and the grave blessing was so important. On the cover of the book, I have a grave blessing from Sturgis. I love the picture on the cover of the book because it's a guy in a very Western, almost cowboy-looking outfit. They cut off his boots, but he had cowboy boots on, doing a very typical Ukrainian gesture, which is leaving a collage, a funerary bread at the graves of his ancestors. Yeah, I said all these wonderful things about the churches and how important they are, but we've all talked, as you know, I was chatting with people prior to this, the churches are closing. This happens to be St. Elias in Roxton, not too far from Yorkton. That's the problem. When this family, a very wealthy family, lived in Roxton, Roxton is nothing. They ran a John Deere dealership. For farmers, a John Deere dealership is very important. They had a lot of money. They put it into this gorgeous St. Elias church. The roads get better. People have trucks. People have cars. They don't need to go to Roxton for their John Deere stuff. They go to Yorkton. This family moves to Yorkton. I'm not, if you want to look at some of the pictures or ask me about some of what's happening to St. Elias, so why it's a mess. Let's put it this way. This is 2015. It's worse now. This is Chris Zorniak, now deceased. He tells me, so some of it's mechanization. He says, I program my harvester or whatever. I sit on it. It does the thing. You don't need a lot of people. Ron, oh gosh, what's Ron?
DeSantis?
What?
DeSantis? No.
No. But Ron Olenek, I think it's Olenek from Sandburg. He was 78 years old in that picture. He could run an entire farm by himself with the sun coming in on weekends because of the But I don't think enough people have paid enough attention to this. It's not just mechanization. It's not just people migrating to cities for better opportunities. It's the fact that huge tracts of farmland are being bought up by large corporations. The sort of community that you had when you got these guys that come in, run the harvesters or run whatever huge machinery needs to be run, you don't have a community. So people are leaving. If you've got 5 or 6 parishioners left, they just can't afford the church. They can't. It's just too much money. So churches are closing. We took pictures of the closing of the church in St. Yaroslav in Bruderheim, Alberta. Peter cried. You know, man, Peter's not Catholic. Anyway, so this was a desanctification, at which point it became a building used on a summer camp. A lot of churches are burnt. When they're burnt, very often you leave the cupola over the ashes. So that's Birmingham, the lower one is Bank End. So because of this, the Sanctuary Project set out to document churches as best as we could. Francis and John Paul did the photography, and so did the volunteers. I did the interviews. And I asked about weddings and family rituals, baptisms and funerals, and I asked about calendar, like Christmas and Easter. What I learned was really, I think, very important to realize. And you know, when people say, okay, it's great to be Ukrainian, we all love Ukrainian, as people in Edmonton would tell me, and I think in Winnipeg as well, if you're not Ukrainian, you marry one. It's good to be Ukrainian. But, you know, when people talk about it, they think about preservation of old stuff. What I see on the prairies is not preservation of old stuff. And I think this is very important. It's creativity. It's coming up with things that are new. That's what makes the culture vibrant. It's what makes the culture live. Like when I was looking at weddings, and this is from a place called Roycroft in Alberta, Ingrid Chalice had the wedding truck of her mother-in-law who came from Ukraine to get married, but she did not wear these nice Ukrainian clothes. People very quickly switched to the white wedding dress. I can talk more about Ingrid. This is Kathy Bonner. People like Elena, how many of your moms, etc., wedding dresses I photographed? They went to white wedding dresses. They did not do the korabai, which I'll talk about in a little bit. They essentially, it's kind of a marriage of two cultures, at least on the physical level, where the clothing and the food is Western, the identity is Ukrainian. And one of the reasons I think that there was a blending of two cultures with things like weddings, wedding is the joining of two families, as it is the joining of two families. So it's kind of almost sets the pattern for a joining of two cultures. In the 1970s, though, with the multiculturalism efforts, there was an attempt to bring back Ukrainian practices like the korabai, which is a wedding bride in Ukraine. When I was doing work in Ukraine, everybody had a korabai. And what would absolutely freak out Ukrainians that had recently come from Ukraine is you don't eat your korabai, you put it in your china cabinet, preferably dried out so it doesn't rot. And because in Ukraine, you had to eat the whole thing. If you didn't eat the whole thing, your marriage would go bad. And here, it's essentially an object. And I think what happened, this is, by the way, Elaine, you remember this picture. Remember this picture? I believe this is a styrofoam cake.
Yes, yes.
Okay, in certain parts of Saskatchewan, if you want a fancy cake, and especially if you want a tiered cake like that, you're not gonna take a fruit cake and balance it on those little posts, by the way. It's a styrofoam cake with very pretty icing, looks gorgeous. And I think this pattern of a cake that you don't eat, usually the bottom layer of a styrofoam cake is eaten. The top layers are not. And I think that influences the preservation of the korabai. So in weddings, you said, at least with the food and the clothing, you've got this mix. I see this also with things like baptism, and this was really important to me. Now, the traditional baptism, I don't know how many of you know this, you're not supposed to bury unbaptized people in the graveyard. You're supposed to bury them outside the graveyard. I could give you tons of pictures, but this is the one that upset me the most. This is an unbaptized kid buried next to an outhouse. I said that was the one that usually you see the little crosses at the edge. But this was the fact that a kid was buried next to an outhouse. This is tough now. In Saskatchewan was things that bugged me the most. Tony Hutzulak, can you see that he was a veteran? That's the maple leaf. Yeah. And you see the little white crosses. Those are the unbaptized infants. And this particular monument says baby Hutzulak. It was his son. And he said, if you're going to bury my son outside of the graveyard, I'm going to get buried outside of the graveyard with him. So there was this is the 1970s, even back then there was protest against this practice. And Gerardine and Mike Moitas of Model Farm, one of the things that they did, they made a big effort to kind of reclaim unbaptized babies. In Model Farm, they actually moved the cemetery fence to include those babies, to include those graves that were at the edge of the cemetery. And the priest came out from Yorkton and blessed them. In a lot of places, this is Cousy of Saskatchewan, they would put up cenotaphs with the names of the babies where they knew names, and usually a plaque saying, and for all those babies whose names we don't know. There are quite a few of these. So right now, there's a very, I guess, starting about 10 years ago, there's a very active reclamation of unbaptized babies. Now, when it comes to suicides and cremated individuals who you also are not supposed to bury in the cemetery, more ambiguous. Not recognition by the churches with the unbaptized infants, but this is Jedburgh. This is not the cemetery, this is the edge of the cemetery. Somebody who committed suicide. But the people who are working the cemetery say, hey, this is one of ours. And they mow this path to connect the suicide to the rest of the cemetery. In one place, the wife of the man, that was sort of like Tony Hutzulak, she said, he was not a sinner because he committed suicide. He was sick. If somebody who's sick dies, do they bury him outside of the cemetery? No, they don't. This guy was sick, so why are we burying him outside the cemetery? This is Foam Lake. You're not supposed to bury cremated individuals outside the cemetery. The person whose stone is here moved to Ottawa. Do you know how much it cost and wanted to be buried home in Foam Lake? Do you know how much it cost to ship a body from Ottawa to Foam Lake? Like a lot. And so what this person had done was she was cremated and shipped to Foam Lake. You're not supposed, they asked the priest to bury this person in the cemetery. We're told no, so they went and did it themselves. And they didn't, how do I know? They told me. It was no secret. And a lot of other people and the thing has not been moved. People are accepting this. So this is, I'm just giving you 2 instances. There are a lot more. In general, burial in Canadian soil becomes incredibly important. David Bushminski, who's the guy in the center right here, talked about burying your ancestors in Canadian soil as planting seeds in Canada from which people culture would grow. We're in this place, and this is Yaroslav, this is in Bruderheim. And I said, what's this stuff on the graves? It was like glass bits embedded in the cement. And he says to me, but do you know why they have those cement slabs on top of the graves? I said, no, why? That's because we don't want the dead to get up out of their graves and try to go back to Ukraine. All right. It's the idea that, the attraction of Ukraine and wanting to go back. And I've run into this again and again and again, that the fear of ancestors, this is a wedding, and not a wedding outfit, a funeral outfit. That's a very traditional Ukrainian outfit. And it was not put on the woman. And I think this is, again, the fear that if you put them in Ukrainian, real Ukrainian stuff, they're going to go back to Ukraine. I ran into something that totally freaked me out, the practice of the wedding of the dead, that you have to go through all the rituals in your life. And if you're not married, hey, they're going to combine a funeral and a wedding, which is called the wedding of the dead, to make sure you've gone through all the rituals. And again, I can talk more about this later. And this is not ship, and I'm going to forget where it is. Natalie Kononenko, who I interviewed in Priestville, used cemeteries to make a statement. She was from a little town which was west of Priestville. I don't know if you know about Priestville, but this town I'm sure you didn't hear about. She did not want to become a prairie wife. She went to Toronto. I think I interviewed with her when she was dying from cancer. And so it was a little hard to interview. Anyway, but I think she was a model. She was certainly a hairdresser, and a very good one. And one of her clients taught her how to invest in the stock market. She became incredibly wealthy, and she donated this to the cemetery in Chekhov. This is the cemetery in Chekhov. I'll come back to it in a second. Why? Well, she said she was recovering from cancer. She's standing looking in the mirror, and in back of her, she sees Jesus like over her in the mirror. She said, what does Jesus want of me? Thank you for curing me and all that. And she decides that he wants a statue in the Priestville cemetery, well, not in Priestville, it's just Chekhov cemetery. And then she said he's lonely. So she gives him Mary, Mother of God. And she does, these are in granite. They're almost life size, all 14 stations of the cross. Do you know how much that cost? They were not done. They were not made in Priestville. They were made, I don't remember where, and shipped. You know how much it cost to ship a huge granite statue? And she said to me, well, some of this is a religious act. And some of this is that she wanted to be her own. She said, I could have donated the money, but here I decide what it is. I make a statement. And that's what she did. I talked about calendar. Unfortunately, most of these things like Christmas is now almost entirely in the home. Being able to go from one place to another, like with this caroling star, is almost non-existent. Can you imagine walking from one farm to another in a place like Saskatchewan? No. But, well, I can talk more about caroling later. This is Shirley Korbutniski, whose children I was hoping would come here tonight, but I don't think so. but she makes incredible pisanki, and her two daughters apparently paid their way through the University of Saskatchewan by making pisanki. And the other thing is that it's no longer necessarily an Easter thing. It's now a Ukrainian thing. As in this Bakerville pisanka, some people make pisanka mosaics. And of course, they have pisanka bingo and look, February, well, there are a lot of adaptations. An incredible number of people still make paski and babki. I have a very cute picture in the book of a woman who made babki for all her kids. And one of her grandkids said, "Oh, look, my little Baba," because she apparently had a big Baba and a little Baba. "My little Baba made me a little Baba," because she made her a little paska. So a lot of the paski and kolachi are made in church. Our church sells them. There are all sorts of interesting things like lotteries after your provody or after your prazdnik. I like snowmobile bingo is probably one of my favorites. Church fundraisers. There are pierogies for sale. I love Roy Collett. I would love to get a copy of my book to Roy Collett. And, Roy Collett not only makes the best pierogies I've ever had, but he managed to re-roof the entire church in Holy Trinity Church in Sturgis by selling pierogies. And it's a big deal. A lot of non-parishioners come to help out. So it's a social event. See, this is all examples of adaptation. People love it. And it's not just the Ukrainians that love it. By the way, in North Battleford, not too far from here, they have Obzhinki, which is an interesting combination of spas, a Ukrainian event, and Thanksgiving, they're both fall events. One of the spas we just had at our church recently, and it has all sorts of good things like meals and greetings and dance. It's so Holodomor Pisanki. When I was going back through my data, I said, Pisanki, Holodomor, weird. But of course, when you're interviewing, you don't think to ask, like, why? Why Holodomor, which is starvation, combined with Thanksgiving, which is like food almost to excess. And I found this picture of Stalin cutting up pisanki. Makes sense. Okay. Interestingly, they have started now, well, at least last time I heard, they'd started events for new arrivals, not the newest arrivals, but there are pipe fitters in North Battleford with their kids, and they started doing masana, which is not much of a prairie event for these kids. Malanka is a big thing. Malanka is, in theory, an event after New Year's. Sometime, well, it should actually be New Year's Eve, but it isn't quite. It's essentially now, because you have to do all this adaptation on the prairies, it's a winter event. And a lot of churches have it. There's a meal with Ukrainian food. Everybody loves Ukrainian food, Ukrainian dance, performed by kids and adults. And you raise lots of money. The Stephen Mary Rudy did it, Roy Collett did it. The one that Stephen Mary Rudy did started out in the church in Codet, which is tiny, is now, well, actually, it hasn't been done for the last couple of years because of COVID, but it was done in Nipawin. It got, if you know what Nipawin is like, it gets 400 people. Even I don't have the guts to drive across the prairies in the middle of winter. It was in Nipawin. It was when the Humboldt Broncos were going to Nipawin that they had that horrible accident. And do I want to drive the roads to Nipawin? No. But they get 400 people. And what they've done, Steve Rudy said, I do a good job because I realize that Ukrainian culture sells, and not just to Ukrainians. They have a gypsy fortune teller, they have a yiduch, which is a straw effigy, and they burn it. They have a meal of Ukrainian food, they have dance by kiddies in their Ukrainian costume and dances for adults. They have something which I thought was very, very interesting. A chicken prognosis. Chickens foretell the harvest. How? You don't, again, he actually researched this rather than this being a custom brought over from Ukraine and maintained in the area. You don't feed the chickens all day, then you put water and grain in front of the chickens during this event. And you see what the chickens go for. And if they go for the water, it's going to be a rainy year. If they go for the grain, it's going to be a good harvest. And Steve said that one year they didn't do anything. And finally, one of the chickens pooped. And the hospodar, who was running the thing, said, it's going to be a shitty year. And it stopped during COVID, but it was selling 400 tickets. Anyway, I said my goal was to tell about all these people, not the higher ups, but the ordinary guys. I think it's so important. I think it's so important to let people know about the people that have been overlooked. There's an awful lot of emphasis. I was at a meeting in Toronto. There's an awful lot of emphasis on politics. But that's not the only thing, it's not the only important thing. I think that ordinary people, as I've said before, politicians make your life miserable. The ordinary people and the work they do make your life worth living. So that's been my goal. I hope you buy the book. I hope you enjoy the McGill-Queen. Hopes you buy the book. I hope you enjoy it. And please ask me questions. Somebody want to be the moderator, or you can ask me. I'll be my own moderator. Nobody wants to ask me anything? Like, what's the matter with you, lady, that you drove over? Yeah.
Yes, just following up what we were talking about before too. You look like, for example, the church in Roxton and so many others, with so many people leaving the community and the aging too, that there are only older people there who are perhaps not financially that well off. So what can be done? Can anything in your mind be done to preserve some of these finer churches?
And the churches, okay, you're sitting opposite Keith Bell. You may ask him. Well, I've been at this for a long time. I've tried and tried. The Catholics, and I'm Orthodox, but I will give the Catholics a big plug. They have a very nice museum in Mundare. I wish the Orthodox had a similar museum. Because you look at the objects. Now, Roy was showing me all the little rushniki that his mom embroidered for the church. They're gorgeous. Roy had no children. What's going to happen? No. People won't, there's no museum that'll take these. At least, I'm hoping that at least like in the Catholic Museum in Mundare, the preservation of ritual objects, icons, crosses, the tetrapods, I think, I'm trying to remember where it is, the hand-painted tetrapod that they try to get me to take. This thing is was about the size of this lectern. I couldn't get it into my car. Not to mention the fact that I didn't think it was nice of me to make off with their tetrapod, but at least the ritual objects, we're trying to lobby the Orthodox eparchy as much as we can. We'll see what happens with the influx of the Ukrainians that have come now. Some of them will stay. The importance of Ukrainian culture, maybe, is coming to the fore. I want to write one more book, and it'll be based on the interviews that I did in Ukraine. I did them between 1998 and about 2011, which is when I went to Kazakhstan, and then I got too involved in the Sanctuary Project. Looking back, I never wrote that particular book because all sorts of things happened in my life that I won't go into. Essentially, I moved to Alberta. And looking back, because I got the distance of time, I see that the Ukrainians in Ukraine, at least in villages, maintain traditional culture. Maybe not what professors want traditional culture to be, despite the Soviet Union. So the Soviet Union would say you would have to do your wedding, la 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 la, and you have to do it in the klub, which is a Soviet institution. And the Ukrainians in the villages said, okay, you want us to get married in the klub, fine. So they registered their wedding in the klub. And then they go home and they do the whole traditional thing, the processions back and forth and the ritual towels and the breads and the candles and all that stuff. What I'm saying here is the strength of Ukrainian culture. If that strength is there, and I think it is, maybe the strength of Ukrainian culture in Canada, especially now, with all the attention to Ukraine because of the war, will have influence on Canada. Maybe that'll be that push, that impetus that'll help. Well, we need money. If you're going to have I can afford to give away a few books, but I can't afford to, my husband will attest to it. We can't afford to fund a museum. It's just, we can't. An individual can't, a family. Other questions? Comments? Do we have comments from people online?
Doesn't look like anything. Sorry.
Well,
If you like, I can wrap things up and let people greet you at the table.
yeah, and I could sign books.
All right, I'll say a quick word here before I let you mingle with Natalie. I'd like to thank her again for being with us tonight.
Thank you.
Thank you. And I will now invite you to meet her at the signing table with your copy of Ukrainian Ritual on the Prairies, which can be found on the desk next to you there, and she'll be right at that back table. Thank you all for coming out tonight, and enjoy the rest of your evening.
Thank you.